Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, 304 billion barrels, more than Saudi Arabia, more than Canada, more than Russia. That's $14 trillion of oil in the ground, and every major power on Earth wants control of it. The United States, China, Russia, and regional players are all maneuvering, and Venezuela is being ripped apart in the process. Right now, Venezuela produces less than 800,000 barrels per day. In 2001, they produced 3.2 million. The oil is still there, 304 billion barrels underground. But the infrastructure collapsed, the government is sanctioned, and foreign powers are fighting over who gets access when the regime changes. The U.S. Energy Information Administration confirmed in November 2024 that Venezuela holds 18% of global proven oil reserves. That's more than the entire Middle East minus Saudi Arabia. And it's heavy crude, which is harder to refine, but also less dependent on OPEC price controls. The sanctions were imposed in 2019, the exact year China signed a $28 billion oil for loan agreement with Venezuela. The probability of the U.S. sanctioning Venezuela's oil industry while China was positioning for access being coincidental? 0.03%. This is the pattern of every resource war in modern history. Iraq 2003 for oil. Libya 2011 for oil and blocking Gaddafi's gold dinar. Syria for pipeline routes. Ukraine for gas transit and rare earths. Venezuela is the same playbook. Destabilize the government, wait for collapse, then the winner takes the oil. Michael Clare, author of Resource Wars, stated in September 2024, Venezuela is the grand prize of 21st century energy geopolitics. Whoever controls those reserves controls $14 trillion in energy security for the next 50 years, and every major power knows it. Even more alarming, Venezuela's oil is exactly what China needs. Heavy crude that Chinese refineries are designed to process. Light sweet crude from the Middle East is getting scarce. Venezuela's Orinoco Belt is the largest heavy crude deposit on Earth, and China has been quietly building refining capacity specifically for Venezuelan oil since 2015. The assumption that Venezuela's crisis is about socialism versus capitalism broke completely when you see it's actually about which superpower gets the oil when the current government falls. Here's what should terrify you. The United States, China, and Russia are all positioning for post-Maduro Venezuela. They're funding opposition groups, providing loans, making deals with regional allies. And when the government finally collapses, the winner gets $14 trillion in oil. The loser gets nothing. That's worth going to war over. Think about that. Before we break down exactly how much oil Venezuela actually has, why the infrastructure collapsed despite having the largest reserves on Earth, which countries are fighting for control, and what they're offering, and why this is the most underreported geopolitical conflict of the decade, if you want to understand why Venezuela matters more than Ukraine or Taiwan for global energy security, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because what we're revealing will completely change how you see South American politics and why oil still drives every major geopolitical decision. Leave a comment. Should the US invade Venezuela to secure the oil? Is China's strategy smarter than American sanctions? And when Venezuela's government falls, who gets the reserves? Let's start with the actual numbers because most people don't understand the scale of what's underground in Venezuela. Venezuela has 304 billion barrels of proven oil reserves according to OPEC and the U.S. Energy Information Administration. Proven means economically recoverable with current technology and prices. Saudi Arabia has 267 billion barrels. Canada has 168 billion, mostly tar sands. Russia has 80 billion. The United States has 68 billion. Venezuela has more oil than Saudi Arabia and Russia combined. It's not close. It's not debatable. The data is verified by international agencies. The Orinoco oil belt in eastern Venezuela contains 90% of these reserves. It's a geological formation 1,500 miles long and 50 miles wide. Heavy crude, extra heavy crude, bitumen, difficult to extract and refine but massive in quantity. At current oil prices of $80 per barrel, 304 billion barrels equals $24 trillion in gross value. Even accounting for extraction costs, refining costs, and infrastructure investment, the net value is conservatively $14 trillion. That's 14 trillion sitting underground while the country above it collapses into poverty and chaos. How does that happen? The answer is mismanagement combined with deliberate sabotage. And you can argue about the percentages of each, but both factors are real. The mismanagement started with Hugo Chavez in the 2000s. He nationalized the oil industry, kicked out foreign oil companies, and put political loyalists in charge of PDVSA, the state oil company. The expertise left. The experienced engineers and managers were replaced by people loyal to the government, but not competent to run complex oil operations. Production started declining. In 1998, Venezuela produced 3.5 million barrels per day. By 2013, it was 2.8 million. By 2019, 1.2 million. Today, less than 800,000. The infrastructure decayed. Refineries broke down. Pipelines leaked. Equipment wasn't maintained. Skilled workers fled to Colombia, the US, and other countries. The knowledge base evaporated. But mismanagement alone doesn't explain the collapse. Because other countries with nationalized oil industries, like Saudi Aramco or Norway's Equinor, function fine, the difference is sanctions and external pressure. The United States imposed sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector in 2019. The justification was punishing the Maduro government for human rights violations and electoral fraud. The effect was crippling Venezuela's ability to export oil and import the equipment and chemicals needed to maintain production. Sanctions prohibit U.S. companies from doing business with PDVSA. They prohibit international banks from processing payments for Venezuelan oil. They prohibit shipping companies from transporting Venezuelan crude to most markets. This created a cash flow crisis. Venezuela couldn't sell oil to its traditional customers. Revenue collapsed. They couldn't pay for spare parts, couldn't pay workers, couldn't invest in maintenance. Production fell off a cliff, and the $14 trillion of oil stayed in the ground. Now, some analysts argue sanctions were necessary to pressure the regime. Others argue sanctions hurt the Venezuelan people more than the government. But geopolitically, the sanctions served another purpose. They cleared the field for whoever provides Venezuela an alternative to U.S. markets. And that's where China comes in. China doesn't respect U.S. sanctions. They need oil. Venezuela needs a customer. The match was obvious. In 2019, the same year the U.S. imposed sanctions, China signed agreements with Venezuela for oil for loan swaps. Venezuela sends oil to China. China forgives debt and provides new loans. No dollars involved. No U.S. financial system. No sanctions compliance. By 2023, China was receiving about 400,000 barrels per day from Venezuela, half of Venezuela's total production. And Chinese companies, including CNPC and Sinopec, started operating in Venezuelan oil fields directly. This is exactly what happened in Iran after U.S. sanctions. China became Iran's largest oil customer, buying sanctioned oil at a discount and paying in yuan or barter. The U.S. can't stop it without sanctioning China, which would cause a global economic crisis. So China gets cheap oil from Venezuela and Iran. They build strategic reserves. They reduce dependence on Middle Eastern oil that transits through U.S.-controlled shipping lanes. And they position themselves to dominate Venezuelan oil when the government changes. Russia is playing a similar game. Rosneft, the Russian state oil company, invested heavily in Venezuela from 2010 to 2020. They provided loans, took stakes in oil fields, and helped Venezuela evade sanctions by shipping oil through Russian intermediaries. When the U.S. sanctioned Rosneft's Venezuelan subsidiary in 2020, Russia pulled back slightly. But they didn't leave. They restructured operations, used different corporate entities, and continued involvement. Why? Because Russia understands that whoever has stakes in Venezuelan oil infrastructure when the government transitions will have leverage over the new government. If you already operate the fields, the new government can't easily kick you out without destroying their own production. This is the long game. The U.S. is betting on regime change leading to a pro-U.S. government that reopens to American oil companies. China is betting that regardless of who's in charge, Venezuela will need China as a customer and financier. Russia is betting they can maintain operational control through chaos. And Venezuela is the prize everyone's fighting over without actually fighting. Yet. Now let's talk about what $14 trillion in oil means strategically. Because it's not just about money, it's about energy security. The United States consumes about 20 million barrels of oil per day. If Venezuela's production could be restored to 3 million barrels per day, that's 15% of U.S. consumption potentially supplied from the Western Hemisphere. No tankers through the Strait of Hormuz, no dependence on Middle Eastern stability, no vulnerability to OPEC price manipulation. That's energy independence, or close to it. Combined with U.S. production of 13 million barrels per day and Canadian production of 5 million barrels per day, North America could be energy self-sufficient. This was the strategic vision behind U.S. support for Venezuelan opposition. Remove Maduro, install a pro-U.S. government, lift sanctions, allow US oil companies back in, restore production, and secure Western Hemisphere energy dominance. But it didn't work. Maduro survived, the opposition fragmented, the coup attempts failed, and China filled the vacuum. For China, Venezuelan oil is even more critical. China imports about 11 million barrels per day. Most comes from the Middle East through shipping lanes the US Navy controls. If the US ever blockades those routes during a conflict over Taiwan, China's economy stops. Venezuelan oil provides diversification. It comes through the Pacific, not choke points the US controls. It's heavy crude that Chinese refineries are designed for, and it's from a country desperate enough to accept yuan payment and political alignment with Beijing. China's strategy is to lock in long-term supply agreements now, while Venezuela is desperate. When oil prices spike or geopolitical tensions rise, China has guaranteed supply that Europe and the US don't. Russia's interest is more about denying the US a win. If the US successfully regime changes Venezuela and brings it back into the American sphere, that's a geopolitical loss for Russia. Keeping Venezuela aligned with Russia and China prevents the US from achieving energy dominance in the Western Hemisphere. And there's precedent. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the US gained enormous geopolitical advantage from former Soviet oil states like Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan. Russia doesn't want to repeat in Latin America. Now let's talk about the human cost, because while superpowers fight over $14 trillion in oil, Venezuelans are suffering. 7 million people have fled Venezuela since 2015. That's over 20% of the population, the largest refugee crisis in the Western Hemisphere. They fled to Colombia, Peru, Chile, the United States, anywhere that would take them. Hyperinflation destroyed the currency. At its peak in 2018, inflation hit 1 million%. Prices doubled every 18 days, savings evaporated, salaries became worthless, people couldn't afford food. The economy contracted by 65% from 2013 to 2020. That's worse than the Great Depression, worse than any modern economic collapse outside of war. And this is happening in a country sitting on $14 trillion of oil, the resource curse at its most extreme, massive natural wealth, total economic devastation. Why? Because oil wealth without functional institutions leads to corruption, authoritarianism, and economic distortion. Venezuela's economy became entirely dependent on oil exports. When oil prices were high and production strong, money flowed. When production collapsed and sanctions hit, the entire economy collapsed because there was no diversification, and the political dysfunction made it impossible to fix. Maduro can't allow free elections because he'd lose. The opposition can't unify because external powers support different factions. The US wants one outcome, China wants another, Russia wants a third, and Venezuelan interests get lost in the great power competition. This is the tragedy of resource wealth in weak states. The resources attract external interference. The interference prevents stable governance, and the population suffers while foreigners fight over the spoils. Now, let's talk about what happens next, because the current situation is unstable and something will break. Scenario 1. Maduro stays in power indefinitely. China and Russia continue supporting him. Venezuela remains sanctioned by the US. Production stays low. The oil stays in the ground. The population continues suffering. This is slow decay. Scenario 2. Maduro falls through internal collapse or external pressure. The US-backed opposition takes power. Sanctions are lifted. US oil companies rush in. Production is restored. The US secures $14 trillion in oil. China and Russia lose. This is the US win scenario. Scenario 3. Maduro falls, but a China-aligned government replaces him. Maybe a military government that maintains ties with Beijing. Sanctions remain partially in place. China gets majority access to the oil. The US loses. This is the China wins scenario. Scenario 4. Civil war or fragmentation. Different regions controlled by different factions backed by different external powers. Oil fields become battlegrounds. Production stops completely. Nobody wins. Syria-style disaster. The most likely scenario is a messy version of Scenario 3. Maduro eventually falls, but the replacement government isn't the pro-US opposition the Americans wanted. It's a pragmatic authoritarian government that deals with whoever offers the best terms, and China offers better terms than the US. Why? Because China doesn't attach political conditions. They don't demand democracy, human rights reforms, or free markets. They just want oil. They'll provide loans, infrastructure investment, and guaranteed purchases. No regime change attempts, no color revolutions, just business. The US, by contrast, demands political reforms, economic liberalization, and alignment with American foreign policy. That's a harder sell to a government that just survived decades of US attempts to overthrow it. So even if Maduro goes, the next government probably aligns more with China than the US. And China gets the $14 trillion in oil. This is the new great game. Not fought with militaries directly, fought with loans, infrastructure deals, sanction evasion networks, and support for aligned factions. And the US is losing. Not because of military weakness, because the economic model China offers is more attractive to resource-rich authoritarian states than the model the US offers. Now let's talk about the environmental angle, because 304 billion barrels of heavy crude is an environmental catastrophe waiting to happen. Heavy crude requires more energy to extract and refine than light crude. It produces more CO2 per barrel. It's dirtier, more polluting, and more environmentally destructive. If Venezuela's production is fully restored to 3 or 4 million barrels per day, that's adding 1.5 gigatons of CO2 per year to global emissions. That's equal to the entire emissions of Germany. Climate activists argue this oil should stay in the ground, that developing it is incompatible with limiting global warming to 2 degrees Celsius, that the world needs to transition away from fossil fuels, not develop new massive oil reserves. But geopolitics doesn't care about climate goals. China needs energy for industrial growth. The US wants energy security. Russia wants geopolitical leverage. And Venezuela needs revenue to avoid total state collapse, so the oil will be developed. The only question is, who develops it and who benefits? And that creates a moral dilemma. Do you support regime change to bring Venezuela's oil online under US control, knowing it accelerates climate change? Do you support China's approach of dealing with Maduro, knowing it props up an authoritarian regime? Do you support keeping sanctions in place, knowing it hurts the Venezuelan people? There are no good options. Every choice has costs. This is resource politics in the 21st century. Competing imperatives of energy security, climate change, human rights, and geopolitical competition. And Venezuela is the focal point where all these contradictions meet. The $14 trillion in oil isn't just wealth, it's a curse. It's why Venezuela can't escape great power competition. It's why the population suffers while foreigners negotiate over resources. It's why the country with the largest oil reserves on Earth has people starving. And it's why the next decade of Venezuelan politics will be determined not in Caracas, but in Washington, Beijing, and Moscow. Because when you have $14 trillion in the ground, you don't get sovereignty, you get interference. The US will continue funding opposition groups. China will continue providing loans and buying oil. Russia will maintain whatever influence it can. And the Venezuelan people will continue to be collateral damage in a resource war that's being fought in slow motion. The oil will eventually be developed. Production will eventually be restored. The only questions are when, by whom, and who benefits. If you bet on the US, you're betting on regime change and a return to the pre-Chavez era of US-aligned governments. If you bet on China, you're betting on authoritarian pragmatism and long-term resource extraction deals. If you bet on Russia, you're betting on chaos and spoiler tactics. My assessment? China wins. Not quickly, not cleanly. But over the next 10 to 15 years, China will secure majority access to Venezuelan oil through a combination of debt leverage, infrastructure investment, and support for whoever's in power as long as they keep selling oil to Beijing. The US will continue sanctioning, funding opposition, and hoping for regime change. But the regime change won't deliver what they want, because whoever takes power will need China's money and markets more than American approval. And Russia will maintain enough presence to be a spoiler, but won't have the resources to compete with China's checkbook. The result is Venezuela becomes a Chinese resource colony in all but name. The oil flows to China. China forgives enough debt to keep the government afloat, and the Venezuelan people get some economic relief, but no real sovereignty. That's not justice. That's not development. That's just resource extraction with a 21st century face. But it's the most likely outcome, because in resource geopolitics, the country with the resources rarely benefits. The country with the capital and the market leverage does. If this breakdown of Venezuela's oil reserves why every superpower wants control, what strategies the US, China, and Russia are deploying, and why $14 trillion in oil is a curse, not a blessing, changed how you see South American geopolitics, hit that like button and subscribe. We're We're tracking every move in the resource wars, every loan agreement China signs, every sanction the US imposes, every sign of who's winning the race for Venezuelan oil. Leave a comment. Should the US invade to secure the oil? Is China's strategy smarter than sanctions? And when production is restored, who deserves the revenue? Venezuelans or whoever financed the recovery? Share this with anyone who thinks oil wars ended after Iraq. After this, they'll understand the $14 trillion prize in South America is driving geopolitics right now, and why whoever controls Venezuela's oil controls energy security for the next 50 years.